Thank you, Justin, and thank you all for taking the time to join today. I'm excited to present this research from a TREC project, a NITC-funded project that just wrapped up about 2 weeks ago. We just submitted the final report. So today I'll be sharing some high-level findings and key points, but the final report will be available upon request soon. So I first want to take a moment to acknowledge my co-PI, Rob Zako, who's a faculty research associate at the Sustainable Cities Initiative. I also want to acknowledge the 4 graduate students that were integral to this project. We really couldn't have done it without them. And I also want to thank the stakeholders who took the time to talk with us about this research and provided much of the data and information that I'll be sharing today. So I'm going to start today by giving some context for how transportation and climate change are connected. I'll then step into our conceptual framework that describes how we analyze the 4 states that we're looking at. This is a project where we examined case studies in 4 different states. We looked at California, Maryland, Oregon, and Washington. I noticed in the poll that most of you are from the West Coast. We often get asked the question, why do we throw Maryland in there? I'll come into this a little bit later, but we chose these 4 states because they're states that have innovative climate legislation related to transportation, innovative growth management legislation, or both. And so these provided really interesting cases for us to dig into when looking at how states are using transportation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'll then synthesize what we found across the 4 case study states, and I'll close with some of our high-level findings and recommendations. I'm examining how these states are doing in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation to provide lessons for other states. To start with some context, climate change is an issue that's affecting us at a global scale and in the U.S. as well. In the U.S., transportation accounts for about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an important sector in terms of making progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reversing the negative effects of climate change. With that in mind, reducing transportation relies on a 3-legged stool. This 3-legged stool is something that comes out of literature by Ewing et al. And Growing Cooler, as well as others. The key idea here is that in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, we need to focus on vehicle efficiency in terms of how many miles per gallon we're getting. We need to think about the carbon content of the fuel that we're using, and so electric vehicles are sometimes a solution that comes out of trying to reduce greenhouse gases from transportation. And finally, even if we focus on those 2 things, we also need to think about vehicle miles traveled, so how far we're driving and how close destinations are together. In this project, we primarily focus on the 3rd leg of that stool, vehicle miles traveled. That's primarily because we are interested in the relationship between transportation, climate change, and land use, and I'll come to that a little bit later on. Vehicle miles traveled is also important because it sets the framework for why states have gotten involved in this issue. So to date, approximately 34 states have climate action plans, and 29 of those states have adopted greenhouse gas reduction goals. We're looking at innovative states that have passed legislation aimed at driving down greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, primarily from vehicle miles traveled. When states decide that they're going to adopt goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they often adopt greenhouse gas reduction goals that focus on all sectors in state statute. That's the case with the 4 states that we're looking at today, as well as several others. Some states also break things down by sector. In this project, we're looking primarily at the transportation sector. As I already mentioned, there are 3 legs of the stool that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and we're focused primarily on vehicle miles traveled. There are 3 primary ways that are discussed in the literature to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle miles traveled. One of those is through transportation strategies. That means that we promote modes that are less carbon intensive. We make those more attractive, things like biking, walking, and transit. The second way is through pricing. That could be through carbon taxes, perhaps through cap and trade, but the idea here is that we make carbon-intensive modes of transportation more expensive. Finally, there's land use strategies that get at putting destinations closer together to try to reduce the number of miles traveled and simultaneously promote other modes that do not require driving. With that in mind, it's important to acknowledge the key focus of this overall project, which was looking at how states are integrating transportation, climate, and land use strategies. So as I mentioned before, we picked states that had strong growth management, strong climate planning, or both. It's important to note that both transportation and land use strategies are important components to reducing vehicle miles traveled, and reducing vehicle miles traveled is important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. I also want to note that we focus primarily on the mitigation side of climate change in this project. We're not looking at adaptation when we're looking at these state approaches. So we started this research project trying to figure out what these innovative states are doing. So I'm going to show you the 3 primary research questions that we examined and briefly go over methods before digging into what we found. So as I noted, we picked these 4 innovative states because we wanted to see what was going on in terms of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So the first research question is primarily descriptive. What is the framework for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector via transportation and land use strategies? Our second question gets at a more analytical component, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each state's approach to achieving greenhouse gas reduction goals from transportation. Finally, we wanted to look at what other states can learn from these states that have been innovative. And so we wanted to know what's working well in these 4 states and how we could transfer knowledge to the other states that have not passed statutes around reducing greenhouse gas emissions or have not attempted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. To address these 3 research questions, our primary methods were qualitative. We relied on document analysis, looking at transportation, land use, and climate plans within these 4 states. We also looked at regulations and statutes to figure out what was said in those statutes. And in terms of looking at progress towards reaching greenhouse gas reduction goals, we looked at progress reports. There's other documents that we looked at across different states as well that I won't go into as much depth about here. Our other primary component of our method involved stakeholder interviews. As I mentioned earlier, we conducted stakeholder interviews with about 44 different individuals representing state agency staff, metropolitan planning organizations, local and regional associations such as councils of government, and non-governmental organizations. It was important that we picked our interviewees to represent the policy framework within each state. In examining these states, it's important to take a step back and think about what states are trying to achieve and how they're trying to achieve it. So states follow a similar process. As I mentioned, these states all have statutory goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that have been codified by the legislature. So the first step is setting goals for how much we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a specific date. Then states and regions go about writing plans that show how they're going to go about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then they go about adopting actions which are the implementation mechanisms for helping implement those plans with the intent of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Then those actions should have an impact on the results being reductions in vehicle miles traveled or reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And states generally follow this linear process. So in describing the state frameworks, I'm going to focus on the goals at a high level and describe the plans and actions from each of the 4 states, while also describing how states are monitoring reaching these greenhouse gas reduction goals. As I've said, each state has statutory targets for reducing greenhouse gases from all sectors. That's the column that you're seeing on the left. Each state has a different target and a different time window. Some states have shorter-term goals and some states have longer-term goals. Some of these are adopted in statute and some are adopted currently in executive order. I'm not going to dig into the politics of that. The key takeaway from this is that all of these states have statutory goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions with different time windows embedded. 3 states also have things that focus specifically on the transportation sector. So in California and Oregon, we're looking at per capita greenhouse gas reduction targets from light-duty vehicles. In Washington, we're looking at vehicle miles traveled reduction targets that are statutory. So all of these goals then are used to create plans and actions within each of these states, and we monitor greenhouse gas emissions. So in the next series of slides, I'm going to give a high-level overview of what all of these states are doing, and then I'm going to move into synthesizing what these states have done. So I'm going in alphabetical order here, starting with California, who has been a leader in many of these policies. Several of these other states have followed the lead in terms of what California has been doing, and California has gone pretty far in terms of actually going about taking action towards implementation. So California has a state-level climate plan, which is referred to as the scoping plan that looks at all sectors. I'm not going to talk about that really at all. The thing that California is most known for is SB 375, which set regional per capita targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from light-duty vehicles. It required metropolitan planning organizations, of which there are 18 in California, to develop sustainable community strategies, which showed how they were going to reach these targets. And it relies on voluntary action from local governments. So something that sets California apart from the other states is that it's not generally seen as a strong state-level growth management state. It's seen as a weaker growth management state, and so implementation by local governments is voluntary. And there are hundreds of local governments in California. California is also unique in requiring Caltrans, the state DOT, to embed scenarios within its state transportation plan, the CTP 2040. And those scenarios require that California show how it's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation 80% by 1990 levels by 2050. So this happens outside of this requirement for the MPOs. As I mentioned, California has gone very far in terms of actually implementing things that are actually taking action to help implement the plans that have been written. So California has a cap and trade program, and a certain share of this money is allocated for implementing sustainable community strategies. That number, I believe, for fiscal year 2014 was about $130 million. But the other thing that California is doing, besides setting aside funding for these things, is regulatory relief. California has the California Environmental Quality Act, which is a NEPA-like process at the state level. And under SB 743, California changes how it thinks about certain projects. So it uses the VMT threshold instead and exempts some projects from CEQA review. This is an example of regulatory relief to try to make it easier to build compact development projects. There's another bill that exempts certain infill projects from CEQA as well. In terms of monitoring, there's statutory requirements to update the scoping plan, the sustainable community strategies, and MPO greenhouse gas reductions targets every certain number of years. California also measures greenhouse gas levels on a consistent basis. Moving into Maryland, Maryland is different from other states in that there's not a specific transportation approach from the state level. Instead, Maryland relies on a multi-sector and multi-agency approach through a state climate plan called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. Maryland was also unique in that it updated its transportation plan, its state land use plan, and its greenhouse gas plan around the same time. And so these plans cross-reference each other, and on paper they're fairly well integrated. It's important to note that Plan Maryland was an initiative that existed under the O'Malley administration that has not been continued under the Hogan administration. And so things have been shifting a little bit because of executive leadership, and that's something I'll come back to later on in terms of findings. Maryland's also a strong growth management state, relying on priority funding areas, as well as requirements for local comprehensive plans. In terms of what Maryland's doing in terms of implementation, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act plan relies on implementing existing programs through things like public transportation and bike ped initiatives, as well as smart growth programs. But to date, there have not been new transportation policies or plans that get at specifically trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Within the plan, there's a thing called enhancements that show additional policies that could be adopted to try to reach these targets. Another thing that makes Maryland unique is they rely on a climate change commission, something I'll come back to later, and they include a sunset provision to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. So the legislature had to act in 2016 to decide whether to continue the plan and whether to continue the targets. And in fact, the legislature adopted new targets to reduce, or new goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, and that was something that was signed by the governor in recent months. Maryland also examines greenhouse gas levels and attributes those to certain actions, and that was something that was a requirement of this legislative requirement to act by 2016. In Oregon, there was this advisory state climate plan several years ago called Roadmap to 2020. It's not seen as a state agency approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there are other components that focus on transportation. One of those is a state plan focused on transportation and the statewide transportation strategy, the STS. There is also something I'm not talking about a ton here, the OSTI initiative. Oregon is similar to California in setting MPO-specific targets, per capita targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. But Oregon was different from California in only requiring that Portland and Eugene go about the scenario planning process, and only requiring that Portland MPO adopt a scenario, which was the Climate Smart strategy, which was adopted by Metro in 2014. All other activity is optional for other MPOs, and some of them have gone about some level of planning, but so far no MPOs have decided to opt into the full process. Oregon, of course, is very well known for innovative land use that gets at compact development through the statewide planning program and through UGBs. In Oregon, there have not been additional initiatives or policies or regulations that have emerged out of the state legislature since the statewide transportation strategy went into place. Overall, when Portland adopted the Climate Smart strategy, they found that existing plans would reach the greenhouse gas reduction targets, but that there's not enough funding to actually implement those plans. Transportation funding, it's something that has been attempted in previous legislative sessions and something that will be coming up again in Oregon, but is a big roadblock to implementing the plans that exist. In Oregon, this initial attempts from the state created the Oregon Global Warming Commission, but it's a commission that doesn't have staff, funding, or authority. However, it produces a report card every 2 years to show how the state's doing, gives the state a grade in terms of how it's doing in terms of progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So in that vein, Oregon also measures greenhouse gas reduction goals and is in the process of updating those MPO targets. Washington was unique in establishing state-level statutory and statute VMT targets. But in Washington, the attempts by MPOs have been voluntary. There's some legal history that I'm not going to dig into in great depth, but all efforts by MPOs have been voluntary, and the Puget Sound Regional Council has really been leading here in terms of integrating land use and transportation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The state of Washington has a state climate plan, and also has a growth management program like Oregon and Maryland. In terms of actions, there have been several studies, and there's some new initiatives out of the Washington State DOT that get at how climate change and growth management can be integrated. Washington also has a long-standing commute trip reduction program that gets at reducing vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. In Washington, the state measures greenhouse gas levels and VMT levels over time. But because there are no MPO targets, there's obviously no requirement to update such targets. I'm now going to move into the analysis component. So we examined these 4 states. I just gave you a high-level overview of the policy approach taken by these 4 states and of the goals and efforts. And so in examining the analysis themes, we look at a similar framework to what we described before, but we also add in what you're seeing in these blue bubbles of looking at things like leadership, institutional relationships, and state and local support that are important components to the success of these state-level plans. So I'm going to break this down into policy framework, leadership, institutional relationships, and state and local support to give you a synthesis to compare across these states. I want to briefly pause and describe institutional relationships. This is something that gets at what we call the vertical relationship between state, regional, and local organizations and agencies, and what we call the horizontal relationship, which is the relationship among state agencies. So the Department of Transportation working with the Department of Land Conservation Development, for example. And all of these things are important components to the policy framework within these states. So I'm giving you these high-level tables. I'm not going to dig into every component, but what I wanted to do was to make sure that this was available through the slides. These tables are things that came out of this report that we just finished, and I want to show these slides as a way to compare across these states. So the first slide gets at the leadership, the policy framework, and the goals. I gave you a pretty high-level overview of the goals a moment ago, so I'm going to skip that to focus on the leadership and policy framework. What I want to point out in terms of leadership is that leadership was really important to all of these states getting involved in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On the West Coast states, there's some early collaborative efforts among West Coast states that influenced initial legislation. And in all of these states, governors were essential to showing leadership around climate change. Oregon is a little bit unique in that interest groups were heavily instrumental in terms of pushing the legislation related to climate change through a larger transportation package a couple years ago. In Maryland, several of the initiatives that have been instrumental in terms of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act emerged out of the O'Malley administration, and so having a strong governor was really important. In terms of policy framework, California and Oregon are fairly consistent in terms of relying on MPOs, although in Oregon, not all MPOs are required to take action. Washington's shared governance is very important. In Maryland, the approach relies explicitly on the state level. There's no delegation to MPOs or local governments. Everything focuses on state agencies and what state government can do. Maryland is also unique in establishing a climate change commission, which integrates non-governmental organizations, private sector, and state and local agencies as a way to oversee these broad greenhouse gas efforts. The next phase here moves into planning. This gets at how state and regional organizations are responsible for planning. This gets at some of the key things I talked about a moment ago in terms of how land use, transportation, and climate change are integrated, and how transportation plans, climate plans have been updated to reflect greenhouse gas goals. So 2 consistent things in California and Maryland. We're relying on strong environmental agencies. In Maryland, the Department of Environment. In California, the Air Resources Board, which sits inside the California EPA. In both of those states, there's also a state plan that focuses on all sectors. Some states have updated their long-range transportation plans to reference greenhouse gas emissions. Other states have not. In California and Oregon, there are separate approaches that rely just on what's going on through the state DOT, aside from what's being required at the regional level. Washington, as I mentioned, has distributed authority, but also has conducted studies on how growth management and climate change programs can be implemented. I've already talked a little bit about the differences at the regional level. In California and Oregon, MPOs have a key responsibility, and in California, the regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategies must be integrated, and all MPOs are required to plan. And Maryland doesn't require anything from the MPOs, so all action by MPOs is voluntary. In Washington, action by MPOs is voluntary as well. MPOs are not required to be engaged, and as I mentioned, there's a lawsuit that gets at some of those key elements. So I'm going to move into the implementation and monitoring side of the synthesis. So one thing I alluded to earlier is that California has really taken the lead and showed great leadership in terms of passing new legislation after the initial climate and transportation legislation to actually go about implementing these plans. And that's taken place through both funding, through the cap and trade program, as well as regulatory relief. Despite that, California still faces challenges in terms of funding to implement sustainable community strategies, and still faces challenges in terms of having money to balance expansion of transit with maintenance of existing facilities. In Maryland, Oregon, and Washington, the key mechanisms were in place before climate programs passed, particularly in the case of land use strategies. So these states had been doing many of these things before we thought about climate change and before these things passed. There are some attempts to think about how we might go beyond those in Maryland through enhancements, but in all of these states, there's a need for more funding to implement the plans. And there are often funding constraints that get at how transportation funding can be used. That's particularly the case in Oregon with constitutional limitations on gas tax use. Washington and California have also had separate efforts around high-speed rail and expansion of mass transit that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but are happening sort of in tandem and not sort of in coordination. In terms of monitoring, states are generally tracking greenhouse gas levels, but there's generally a lack of monitoring of the actual plans and strategies themselves, and there's not necessarily a feedback loop to figure out how greenhouse gas emissions are being obtained. There's a side thing here going on with the recession and greenhouse gas emissions showing reductions because of the recession, but vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions increasing after the recession. But what's generally going on here is some reports and some monitoring, but a lack of feedback loop into the planning process. A lot of this has to do with the fact that a lot of these plans are relatively recent. If you go back to the goals table, you see that these things are only 4 or 5 years old, and it takes a long time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm now going to spend the remainder of the time, the last several minutes, talking about some of the key findings and recommendations. This slide outlines how we frame our key findings and recommendations in the final report. So we break things down into 7 categories that you see on the right in terms of leadership, goals, planning, institutional relationships, implementation, monitoring, and regional and local support. And for each of these categories, we show a finding, a recommendation, what sort of organization and what level of government should be responsible, and we provide an example of a state, a model that shows a good example of showing how this recommendation can be achieved. So today I'm just going to show some of the high-level findings and close with a short table that summarizes some of our high-level recommendations. Within the report, across these 8 areas, we show 28 findings and recommendations with these organizations identified. So I'm going to use graphics to show some of the key findings and recommendations here. So across states, we found that environmental groups were important to pushing and sustaining support for legislation. That was certainly the case in Oregon and California, but has also been the case in Washington and Maryland as well. In Maryland, the civic sector has been instrumental in terms of overseeing some of the efforts around the Climate Change Commission and doing some of the reporting that's been required by state statute. And so there's great examples of the non-governmental organizations and state agencies working together on several of these issues. In terms of the planning process, both California and Oregon show great examples of establishing greenhouse gas reduction targets, but allowing regions flexibility for showing how they're going to reach those targets. That was very important for obtaining political support. So instead of being prescriptive about what policies different regions need to implement or local governments need to implement, there's this flexibility to let regions figure out how they're going to reach those goals. Because we're giving, and particularly in California and Oregon, but also other states, because we establish these broad goals in statute that say we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2040 or whatever the goal may be, we then have to model how different policies will help us reach those goals. And so there's a heavy reliance on modeling, there's a heavy reliance on making sure that those assumptions are correct, and there's this reliance on scenario planning to show how we're going to reach those targets and allow us to play with different policy levels. I'm showing you an example of scenario planning from Oregon. There's other examples of showing what the scenarios look like and how we go about establishing those scenarios. But the key takeaway here is that modeling is really important, and it's also very expensive. MPOs vary in terms of technical capacity and funding, and so it's very important to think about how MPOs vary in terms of those things and provide state support for being able to conduct modeling in smaller MPOs that might not have the capacity. One thing that's come out in terms of implementation and monitoring is that it's very useful, productive to assign responsibility to an agency that already has a budget and staff and authority, as opposed to creating a new organization that has very little staff, authority, and funding. And so in California and Maryland, using the environmental organizations was very key. In Oregon, using an organization that has very little staff and authority has not been seen as effective. In Washington, there's been an attempt to distribute this authority across different agencies, and that's something that reflects the culture in Washington. One thing that's come up across states as well is that silos between state agencies and between regional and state governments have hampered implementation. And so one of the big issues that makes this challenge so complex is that land use plans occur at the local level, regional transportation plans occur at the regional level, and a lot of these targets are happening at the state level. California showed great support and acknowledgement that going through sustainable community strategies has improved some of these relationships across the agencies and between state and regional governments. And so while silos can hamper implementation, there are examples of improving that over time. One big finding that I want to come back to again in our in just a moment in terms of our key takeaways is that there's a large disconnect between establishing goals, going about adopting plans, going about implementing different policies and regulations, and tracking results. These things are often happening from different sectors of the government. Some things are happening in the legislature, some things are happening through bureaucracy, some things are happening through the governor, and there's little connection between these things. There's also this sort of linear process that we describe in our conceptual framework. Well, we find that going about thinking about this as more of a circular feedback loop is more effective. To set goals with thinking about what's implementable in mind, to then go about assigning responsibility for achieving those goals, to plan, to implement, to monitor, and to feedback that information into the goal-setting process. Part of this is, again, a timing issue and that some of these things are brand new, but we recommend as we enter the second phase of plans and strategies to go about thinking about that feedback loop and thinking about establishing performance measures as well, which is something we'll come back to in just a moment. Another thing that was a key takeaway from some of these states is that framing outcomes as co-benefits can help gain public support. So several stakeholders mentioned that when we talk about just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, citizens and other groups don't seem really care as much, but when you think about what you can achieve while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, this co-benefits, it's often easier to gain public support for these efforts. To date, there's been a weak integration of transportation and land use plans and lack of sort of considering these funding decisions. So while we want things to be combined in terms of transportation and land use, these things are often happening separately. A big issue has been the lack of funding and incentives for planning at the state and regional level. So we go about requiring regions in California and Oregon to write these plans, but then we don't have funding to actually implement these plans. And that's been a key issue across several places, and that's the case in Washington and Maryland as well. The other key issue here is that some of our funding sources have constitutional constraints, and so we don't have funding for transit and redevelopment in the way that we might need to be able to go about incentivizing other modes and incentivizing infill development. Another key issue has been this lack of holding states and regions accountable to the targets. So in each of our stakeholder interviews, we asked how the states were being held accountable. Who will be held accountable for reaching these targets? If we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions by X% by 2020, who's on the line? And what we found was there's often finger pointing between different agencies, but really there's no enforcement. There's no one saying, okay, you have to reduce goals by this level, and it's a really difficult thing to try to embed. Political cycles are another thing that makes this fairly difficult. This last slide is something I'm not going to go into great depth about in the interest of time, but what I wanted to do is give an example of some of the findings and recommendations that we summarize in our report. And so some of these things were things I just mentioned. What I want to just briefly harp on is that while some of the things I just mentioned were critical and talk about some of the sort of barriers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we also want to end on a positive note in terms of offering examples of recommendations, ways to improve this process moving forward as we enter, again, the second phase. So what I want to touch on a little bit more is leadership. So one big issue here has been that as governors change and as legislatures change, there's often this attempt to make a mark on sort of the policy that you want to have, and then there's this lack of sort of paying attention to it after the executive and legislature change. One way to go about sort of responding to that is to use climate change commissions, which have appointment periods that overlap executive leadership. Some of the other things we've mentioned a little bit more. It's important to provide technical support for planning, particularly if we're relying on modeling. It's also important to think about how we can go about funding these plans and think about how we can go about incentivizing compact development. So some of the key examples here rely on providing incentives, whether it be through funding, by removing constitutional limitations, as well as removing restrictions on trying to get to infill development. So there's regulatory barriers as well as funding that can improve here. In terms of oversight of plans, it's important to think about assigning responsibility to an organization that has staff and funding authority to actually be able to oversee the plans. So in the last couple minutes here, I want to close with some key takeaways before opening it up for questions. So the thing I want to point out is that the 4 states that we are exemplars for other states. these states have gone above and beyond trying to use state action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in the absence of federal leadership. These are states that have modest public support and political will for doing such things. But the initial legislation for setting goals and plans required leadership, primarily from the executive. However, in order to make sure that we achieve these goals, sustained leadership and momentum is essential. This gets back at this leadership issue I just mentioned. And we can do all the planning and scenarios that we want, but without funding and without reorienting transportation spending, we will not be able to reach these targets. And so it's not enough just to go about setting targets and requiring plans. There's a need to take action in terms of implementation to actually reallocate resources to implement these plans. One of the big issues is that we set goals, make plans, and implement regulations alongside tracking greenhouse gas emissions without connecting the dots between those goals, actions, and results. And it's very important to think about in the future using performance measures to establish a feedback loop between those three areas. Another key finding that we came up with out of our interviews and research was that selling co-benefits is important to gaining broad support, and that's something that, of course, is important to gaining executive and legislative support. So it's not just about getting leadership, it's also around building support from the public to buy into this planning. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and pass it off to Justin, who I think will be moderating the questions.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So we do have some questions that I'll read off here. If you haven't submitted a question, you can continue submitting those during this question and answer period using the questions pane of your control panel. So I'll start off. I'm going to skip to a question that you had just talked about recently, Rebecca. See if you wanted to add anything. You mentioned the turnover of governors and champions in each state for this. Someone had asked, how do you ensure continuity in these efforts? You mentioned climate change commissions. Maybe you want to say a little bit if any of those are currently in effect, or if you see other mechanisms for ensuring continuity of these efforts.
Absolutely. Thanks, Justin. So as Justin just mentioned, this issue of leadership and executive turnover has been really difficult for several states. And this is something that we frankly, there's some good examples of this, but this is something that is sort of one of those complex problems that I think there's not one solution to get at solving it. But one idea that we propose as one of the recommendations in our report is trying to insulate this attempt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the political process by requiring action from something like a climate change commission as opposed to requiring action from a governor or legislature. One way to do this would be by making a climate change commission that has a broad level of support from broad level of membership from public sector, through state agencies, from NPOs, and from local government, while also relying on the private sector and on governmental organizations as well. While there might be turnover in the governmental state agency positions, there should be less turnover in some of these other positions, and that should allow some continuity across different governors. As one of Governor O'Malley's last acts before his term ended, he established an executive order that would reestablish the Climate Change Commission that had been important in Maryland before. And in the 2015 legislative section, the legislature passed this Climate Change Commission, and Governor Hogan signed this into law. And so the Climate Change Commission is something that has been effective in Maryland, and despite gubernatorial shifts that have diminished focus on some of the land use approaches, the climate change policies have continued to be implemented. And so I think Maryland gives a good example of trying to address that issue.
Great. So you've mentioned that the states have set up some of these efforts in the absence of federal leadership to fill that void. Do you think that federal involvement at this point would be good for these states, or would it, do you think it would derail the progress that these states, these trailblazer states, have made?
That's a great question, Justin. Recently, the federal government put out a notice of proposed rulemaking that includes some reference to greenhouse gas emissions and performance measures. At this point, it seems fairly unclear what direction the federal government might take. But at this point, it seems that the federal government is not sort of at a place to go beyond what these states are doing. I think that to sort of flip the question a little bit, I think that there's things that the federal government can learn from these states in terms of ways to be effective. California provides a great example of integrating regional transportation plans with sustainable community strategies in which these documents become one. And so one long-term recommendation we make is that the federal government could require that to receive federal transportation dollars, state or regional government, NPOs have to go about showing how the regional transportation plans will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think the federal government is there yet, but the threat of withholding federal funds could be a strong motivator to get other regions and states involved in these efforts.
Okay. And this question, what are other front-runner states working on reducing greenhouse gases via transportation-related strategies? I assume that means other states other than the ones, the four that you've studied here.
So that's a great question as well. We're pretty narrowly focused on these four states because of their sort of uniquity in terms of adopting this legislation, but I'm aware of legislation in Massachusetts that gets at greenhouse gas emissions, and there's likely, I think there's others in the East Coast, but I apologize, I'm not sort of equipped at this moment to answer that question.
Okay. There's a sense that the efforts so far may be too little too late. Does any state have a sort of emergency clause that will allow for more drastic action if they're missing their benchmarks?
That's a great question. We did not come across any sort of emergency clause in terms of reaching benchmarks, and it's a great point about being too little too late. A lot of what we found is that states are on track to meet their 2020 goals, but it seems a lot less plausible that they will reach their 2040 or 2050 goals. I think this question gets at one of the key points we make around needing some accountability and enforcement mechanisms. And one example of that that came out of some of our stakeholder interviews is the idea of providing more strength to this legislation that would give, this may sound a little odd, but give organizations something to sue over in terms of saying, you're not reaching these goals, you need to do more. I think the reason we haven't seen that is because it is such a complex issue that relies on so many different sectors and organizations, and so it's not that simple. But having the force of law could get to requiring further action on these things. The other thing I would note, though, is that before we got to some sort of emergency clause, it's important to think about removing these constitutional barriers around funding sources to actually give us a shot to reduce greenhouse gas reductions. Justin?
Justin?
Okay, pardon me, I lost my connection there for a second, but I'm back up now. Excuse me there. So this question, you mentioned each state is, quote, measuring greenhouse gases in a monitoring sense. Is this collecting observed data somehow or a modeling exercise?
That's a great question. We looked at the reports that were published by these states, but we didn't dig into the technical aspects of how these things are being monitored. One thing I will note is that many of the reports focus on reporting the levels of greenhouse gas emissions, but don't necessarily dig into why we're seeing the trends that we're seeing by attributing those to actions. And our focus was much more on that aspect of how they're being attributed as opposed to the technical levels themselves.
Okay, and this question's been sort of partially addressed in others, but I'll ask it in full here. Given the complexity with state government making a real difference, what's our best hope for actually reducing greenhouse gases before we're in emergency mode, waiting for the federal government to act, or hoping perhaps for a benevolent private sector? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's also, I'm not digging into it in great depth, but there's great examples of local and regional governments leading the way as well, local and NPOs leading the way as well. In terms of how to get over this hump of state and federal action, it's a very, very good question, and something that I think states haven't necessarily done a great job considering, and federal government hasn't done a great job considering as well. But again, I think what I would encourage is thinking about sort of, we know what we need to do, we know how to reduce vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions, we know it takes a long time to get there, and so setting ourselves up in terms of policies by thinking about these regulatory barriers to getting to compact development, thinking about how these silos hamper implementation, and thinking about doing as much as possible without state or federal action in terms of things that can be done without acts of legislature, I think is an important thing for states to think about. It's going to vary by state, but thinking about those constraints on funding sources and how fundable they are, or thinking about passing legislation that might create new funding sources or ballot initiatives that might create new funding sources, is something that states should be considering.
So we've been talking primarily about states and states versus federal, but I was wondering if you think that states should be the primary players in here, given the progress that MPOs have done, if this is sort of better handled by delegating it to the regions. I think that it's kind of a two-part question there. Something I didn't dig into in great depth today that we dug into in greater depth in the report is that MPOs vary in terms of their level of authority in different states. So in California, it worked really well to rely on MPOs because MPOs are very strong and have very high levels of authority over how their transportation dollars are spent. That is not the case in other states. In other states, it's very clear that states have a greater level of authority, and MPOs essentially serve as a pass-through for those funds. And so it gets at really needing to know where transportation funding decisions are being made and who is responsible for those. The same is said for land use. If the state is primarily responsible for land use decisions, it makes sense to rely on state government. But if the locals are primarily responsible, it's going to be important to use incentives to get locals to be encouraged to participate in such efforts. And so it requires an acknowledgement of the political culture and political structure within the state, which is something that we dig into in a lot greater depth within the report. You just. Oh, sorry, I didn't quite catch that there.
I'd say there's not a one-size-fits-all approach at this point.
Oh, okay, great. And you did mention land use planning just now, and I think we have time for this last question here, which is about how states can merge climate planning into their land use planning or other existing structures.
So that's a great question. A couple of ideas that we dug into. A lot of the land use aspects get at trying to encourage or not actively discourage compact development. And so it gets at things around density and things around often transit-oriented development and how land use and transportation decisions should be coordinated. It gets at relying on land use plans, encouraging destinations to be closer together. And so one reason that Oregon has a strong framework is because of this use of urban growth boundaries to require the development happens in a more compact fashion. And that's something that's been going on for decades within the state. One thing that I think is important is thinking through how other states that might not have state-level growth management can incentivize getting to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from land use. And I think that can happen to a great extent by incentivizing some of these increase in zoning in certain areas, transit-oriented development, promoting infill and redevelopment over greenfield development to, again, try to reduce vehicle miles traveled by promoting compact development.
Well, great. Well, I will wrap up the webinar here. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks again to Rebecca for sharing your work. You can view other professional development offerings on our website, nitc.us. This concludes the webinar. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.